We're coming up on 5 years since coronavirus changed our lives and seemingly brought the world to a halt back in 2020. While life has returned to normal for many, some things have permanently changed. That includes many areas of the education sphere where technology had to rapidly evolve to keep kids learning. I spoke with Professor Christine Greenhow at Michigan State University. She studies this specific area. Our conversation highlights some of the negatives and some of the positives when it comes to education in the classroom. We've had so many changes over the last 5 years. What changed from 2020 to now in terms of education and the pandemic? I know that there were so many changes, and what were the implications of that?
Yeah, so if I can take us back to that pandemic moment in 2020 first. So when the pandemic hit, most schools across the nation and globally had to turn to some form of online learning. But what we saw was not the well-designed, well thought out online learning. When that happened, it was an emergency response, a rapid pivot to taking our in-person teaching and moving it online, which had, I would say, mixed results. And especially hard hit were students who lacked access to the technologies they needed at home, were parents who felt ill-equipped to support their students because now teachers were sharing the role of teaching with the family. So all of that led to what we're now seeing as some of the downsides, which are, our reading scores are the lowest they've been in recent history for fourth and eighth graders, and the same thing with our math scores. So the results of the pandemic were that we were pretty hard hit in terms of our content learning for our students.
Yeah, I think so many people maybe fell through the cracks in some of the demographics that you're speaking about. There are holes in where access was available to some of those people during the early days of the pandemic. And I think many areas of the country, it was a slow rebound to get to where they needed to be. But, eventually I do feel like some school systems caught up to where that access was, available to some folks. So, how slow, or I guess how rapid was the response to get to where this was kind of the new normal for everybody, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I'm glad. So that's a terrific question because I think, I've emphasized some of the downsides, but some of the positives were that as teachers got more comfortable teaching online and schools and districts invested in supporting teachers who were trying to like build the airplane while flying it, right? But as teachers availed themselves of professional development, and many teachers turn to social media for support groups, reaching out to other teachers who maybe were a little bit more advanced in their teaching online than say they were, to say, well, this is my situation. What would you do? What have you done? And sharing, lesson plans and advice. So I think teachers started to feel more comfortable with teaching online and began to do it better as they realized what was working, what was good online teaching, and what they wanted to avoid. And so I think the outcome of all that is now we have more flexibility for both students and teachers and families in terms of how people learn. So you might have a student who is ill or has a disability, and now there's an online learning option. Or you might have students who thrived in an online learning environment, and the school now offers those kinds of options for those students and their families. So I think those are some of the benefits that came out of it. In addition, I think you mentioned access. I think um, we as a nation and also school districts were able to identify some of those gaps in internet access, get computers into the hands of students, get laptops in the hands of students and devices, and shore up some of those holes. It wasn't perfect, but it forced us to identify the gaps and then try to stem them.
I think one of the main themes from the pandemic, we were so resilient and, we rebounded in ways that we probably couldn't have even imagined, not just in schooling, not just in technology, but in other areas of our lives as well. So I think that's a really good point that you make. I want to ask, though, because you did mention the holes where some demographics did fall through the cracks, and you mentioned some grades specifically. I want to dive a little bit deeper into that. Where would you say some of the biggest disparities happened during this time? You mentioned a few subjects. If you could go a little deeper into that.
Yeah, so well, I'm not an expert in so what we would call these disparities is a digital divide or where students maybe lack access to a laptop or a device that's sufficient. So learning on your cell phone is quite a different experience than learning on a laptop, as we're talking here. Similarly, in terms of broadband access, if you're out in a rural area and your access is not stable or consistent, that's an issue. So those areas were hard hit. Rural areas, areas where lower income students and families who may not have a laptop at home, or maybe sharing a laptop with, four or five siblings. Um, Families who maybe don't work in jobs that involve a lot of laptop technology and internet use. Now, those families are being called upon to support the teaching that their students are, to help them access materials, and they may be unfamiliar with and right, understandably, learning management platforms and that kind of thing. And then young kids and families were really hard hit. So think about getting a kindergartner or a first grader to spend a day online learning when most of that learning in school would be very hands-on, right? Very social. So I think, and then the families who may have more than one young child trying to help all of their children learn during the same time, I think were incredibly hard hit.
Yeah, so of course now we're about 3 years removed from the end of the pandemic, I'd say. 5 years removed from the start of it. Um, the lasting impacts, I think we all still see that into our day-to-day lives, especially when it comes to technology, when it comes to education. Specifically in Michigan, snow is something that we deal with so much. Inclement weather is something that we deal with so much. Can you talk about how technology was kind of good for school districts in our state specifically, or maybe in other parts of the country, and how that's helped them adapt to some of those rough weather days?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think because the pandemic first forced school systems into online learning, and they had to get very smart very quickly about what works and what doesn't. Now, when inclement weather hits, or a disaster or some kind of weather incident like wildfires or flooding, or it's not a given that we have to close schools. I mean, so the online learning that we had to do during the pandemic gave us a window into an alternative way to keep kids learning, even when school in-person classes are disrupted. So I think that was one of the benefits that came out of it. And I also think for teacher professional development, teacher professional development has always been in person on the school campus. And now that too, people are seeing, well, we don't necessarily have to bring all the teachers in, which can, and feed them, and that can be very expensive. Teachers could learn professionally from the comfort of their home, which might give them a break, save them the commute time, and we can all learn online that way. So, I mean, those are just two examples of how I think weather disruptions can now be, there's an alternative to closing schools when that happens.
Yeah, of course. Might not be so good for the kiddos who want that break or a snow day, right?
I know.
But I mean, still a really nice adaptation, something that we take away from the pandemic as not really thinking like, oh, this actually might have been a good thing for instruction. Well, let me ask you to, have you heard from teachers or districts in your experience, are they having to create lesson plans, for an in-person day and an out-of-school day? Are they having to create two different versions of that lesson? And does that create a more time-consuming preparation for them?
Yeah, that was a big issue. I don't know if I don't know how much that is happening right now, but in the at the tail end of the pandemic, we had some schools going back, some schools weren't going back, and then we had schools who were going in person for those students and their families that wanted to be in person, while remaining online for those students and their families that didn't feel safe coming in person. So now the teacher had to do, yes, that sort of double planning where I've got all these students sitting in front of me, and I've got 10 students online, and I've got to teach both of them. And that was incredibly challenging. The teachers I spoke to, the teachers I interviewed, because I did a qualitative study of teaching during the pandemic, and that was a big issue. That was very, very demanding, very difficult. So I don't know how much that is happening now. I have a feeling now the breakout is more if you have a teacher who's very good at teaching online, then they teach the online classes are options for students, and then you have teachers. I don't know how many teachers are doing both.
That was Professor Greenhow with me there in that conversation. Again, she's noting there just a lot of the changes that education and technology have been through over the past 5 years, touching everywhere from how those students and teachers had to quickly adapt, but not only that, how it changed snow days and how we know that today. And of course, how teachers have really adapted to this. Something else that she added there was while she doesn't study it, the professor noted that AI in technology and in education will be huge and something to watch in the future. She also emphasized the role social media had, especially when it came to connecting with others during 2020. You know, I'm sure you use social media more. I definitely did. And when it came to teachers learning from other teachers during the pandemic, especially when it comes to that social media role there.